Good morning. Welcome back to Rio Grande Perspectives. My name is Chris. Um, Lately, we've been talking a lot about Abraham. In the last video, we were talking about that aspect of his life, especially early on when he was very perceptively looking at the world around him and noticing patterns, noticing incongruencies in so many of the assumptions that people had, um, so many of the idols that people worshipped. He could see that behind all of the massive acceptance of these things, behind everybody's zeal, behind the apparent unanimity of these practices, that there were fatal flaws, that there were things that people were just not really coming to terms with, and instead they were just sort of gliding over it. And he devised tests whereby other people should be able to understand his criticisms. For example, Abraham took the idols in the temple, smashed a bunch of them, left the hammer in the hands of the largest idol, and claimed that it was the idol with the hammer in his hands that smashed up all the other ones, and people said, no, it can't be. That idol is not able to do those things. And he said, yes, exactly. So why do you carry on these religious devotions to this idol? And he invited people to abandon these things and instead to serve the living God. Abraham developed this way of analyzing and confronting the world around him and its assumptions and its values, and it led him to abandon those things and to strive towards God. And both the Bible and the Qur'an call Abraham the friend of God. One of my hopes with this channel is to spend time studying the path of Abraham and to do our best to emulate what he did and to strive after God in the best way possible. So lately there's a lot of talk about the meaning crisis. You'll find several people who are really intelligent dealing with this in some lectures, like Jordan Peterson or John Vervaeke. And if you are a person with an inclination to philosophy, I would recommend checking those things out. And so while there are these people that are tackling this from sort of a high philosophical angle, I wanted to just talk about it from just the simple vantage point of my own perspectives in life. In getting into it, I find it's hard to know where to start because it's such a broad thing. So where do you begin? Because it covers family life, technology, entertainment, pop culture, higher culture, education. It's the whole thing. To go back to Abraham, he lived in a world that was so committed to these things, these idols, these things that were, horrifically bad substitutes for reality. It just can't be overstated how big of a deal it is for him to question the world that he lived in and to step away from it and step toward God. And I think we are all from our own angles, we notice things about the world we are in that astound us. And, I saw that in my own life. I, especially early on as a kid, I was very introverted. And I think that something that usually comes hand in hand with introversion is, instead of participating as much in the world around you, you do much more observing and analyzing of the world around you. And I've been analyzing the world around me for a long time. I'm not as introverted as I was. I own my own business, and that arose from me not wanting to be anybody's employee. So I basically was driven by this desire to get over my introversion. And my business is of such a nature that I end up spending time in many, many people's households. Literally hundreds of people every day, somebody new. And it was a huge eye-opener to meet so many different people and to see these striking similarities between them all. I was really surprised at how infrequently I would run into somebody that seemed to be their own person. And a lot of them are well-to-do. My business basically centers around what you could fairly call a luxury. And so I was running into people that were well-to-do. They achieved a lot. They were well-educated. They had disposable income. And I was, as a person in my early 20s, I was really blown away by how similar they were one to the next. Often, their houses would be set up the same way, with the TV having pride of place in the home, everything, sort of revolving around the TV. If we were to go back to ancient times, like in Abraham's day, you might have household idols. Well, the TV is basically a household idol. Everybody basically pays all kinds of attention to it. You have to shut up and listen to its oracles. Yes, the TV has the pride of place. I would look at the books that people had, same books, like really usually centered around liberal politics type of books. Al Franken had this book, I think it was Liars and Their Lying Lies, or something about liars. And man, I would see this guy's book like everywhere I went in people's houses. And this being just one example of many. I don't want to be here rambling on. I have a bad time with that as it is. But I would see many books, all the same books, all the same low grade, not actually intellectual, nothing great, but it was like cookie cutter. This was in Minnesota, and the other thing is the Minnesota Public Radio on people's home audio systems. So whatever room you would go to, you could still hear NPR with all of the propaganda that it does. It's not to say that they don't have some programming that is, educational. They do, but, overall, if they're going to get into social or political commentary, it's all just obvious propaganda. Just the same likes, the same dislikes. They all agreed on this weird grab bag of values, You know, you could see it in the yard signs. You know, in this house we believe, and you know, and then this list of all these liberal notions of what's right, and these things so often they don't fit together, or they have no reason to be paired up with one another, but somehow they just received this mold and they fit into it. And I was starting to see this, as I said, even in my early to mid 20s, running this business and running into so many people that were strikingly similar one to another. To my satisfaction, this could not be explained simply by upbringing or education. There was something else going on, even if I couldn't put my finger on it. But eventually, it just sort of seemed to me like people were just sort of receiving a signal. And I know that today this is not such an outlandish idea. Today we have a meme about NPCs, where you can get into some parts of the internet where the idea of an NPC is taken literally or explained in literal ways, that there are people, who knows, maybe a lot of them, that just sort of live as though they are you know, vessels that get filled up, or like they are radio receivers, you know, like they get a signal, as it were, you know, we're talking metaphorically, but it's like they're just, they hear the signal come in, you know, beep, 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 you know, and it just sort of controls them. Now, it's not as wild to say that these days, but I'm talking at like 20 years ago, I started to get a sense of this. I went for a period of time even wondering, like, how human is every human being? Like, are there degrees to this? Could you lose your soul? Could you lose part of it? Can you give away? You know, like I think an assumption that many people have is that you either have a soul or you don't. Yes or no. You know, it's a binary thing. Is it 0 or is it 1? But at some point it came into my head that maybe it's not binary. Maybe it's a continuous thing. You could have, let's just say, for example, point, you know, 6.5 of a soul. And if you lived in a certain way, you might lose more of it. You might be knocked down to, you know, 0.4 of a soul. And if it got knocked down low enough, I mean, you might just be, you might essentially become an NPC. I realize that's a bit of a tangent, but as I said, it's hard to try to tackle this whole thing, because it's hard to know where to start. It's so broad. I think you have no choice but to, you know, sort of combine a bunch of tangents together, and you come up with a picture. As a young adult, I was going through these experiences that impressed me that the world is not what it seems. Even among professing, believing Christians, it seemed that the most universal assumption was, okay, sure, these people believe in God and everything, but the world is largely a natural thing. The world is basically, in their eyes, still a thing that what you see is what you get, more or less. That the things that seem strange, that seem unnatural, even by a Christian, by and large, these will be explained away in very pedestrian ways. But it just didn't seem that way to me. It seemed that there was something about the nature of the world and of society that was not natural. It was supernatural. One of the places that I saw it was in how dark things had become since my early childhood. I was born in 1980, and an example I like to look at is Halloween. Um, if you're around my age, you remember Halloween it was a holiday back when we were kids, but it wasn't that dark. It wasn't that important either. It was very widely participated in, but it wasn't that important. It was just, a little thing, a little milestone as you got through the year. Um, Kids would dress up as oftentimes things that weren't even intended to be scary in any way. Things that were totally outside of any character of darkness or scariness. Um, Kids might dress up as dogs or cats or, firefighters or, things that are just totally innocent. Or even if they were going to dress up as monsters, there was something sort of soft and innocent about even the monsters. And then as I grew up, it got very dark. Halloween also became much, much more important in our society. Instead of just being a very minor observance, now there's a huge buildup. Even around Labor Day, you start to see Halloween decorations in the stores. Um, People complain about how Christmas gets started so early. Well, Halloween, it's the same thing now. Interestingly, I have heard several times um, by people conducting economic analysis that Halloween is actually second only to Christmas in terms of attention that is paid to this holiday. And as I said, it got dark, and I don't think it just has to do with me looking at my age cohort as it's growing up, and if I'm looking at when I was 16 or 17 or 20, and I'm looking at my friends and they aren't dressing up as cats and dogs and firefighters anymore, people might say, well, yeah, because they're grown up and they're going to look at different things are going to interest them. No, it's even the kids are dressed up in ways that are very dark compared to, let's say 1988. It's very dark now. Little kids are dressed up as demons and zombies and makeup where there's like slashes and rotting skin and even on little kids. And also things have become much, much more sexual with Halloween. And forget about kids, even grown-ups will celebrate it. There will be Halloween themed events at bars, at pubs, and it's something about the way that this is turned. I mean, I get it. Some people are going to say, oh, come on, you're making way too much out of this. It's just, there's nothing to it. That's just how things turned out. No big deal. Well, okay, you have it your way. But it's not just Halloween, it's a lot of pop culture things. As a kid, another thing I was really into was wrestling. Like WWF wrestling, Hulk Hogan, the Macho Man, Randy Savage, and all those guys. A 7 or 8 year old, 10-year-old, I loved watching that stuff. And my brother and I would watch it. we'd pretend to be those wrestlers and go beat each other up in the yard. And when we were kids, it was so much more wholesome than it is today. You had bad guys and good guys, but the bad guys were not, they weren't evil. They weren't, there wasn't the demonic in them. Just sort of like old school bad guys. They were the thing that made them the bad guys is that they were the opposition to the good guys. They were just like jerks. They were, you know, rude and sort of full of themselves, you know, like Ric Flair, and you know the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. You know, like they had vices, but they were not evil. They were not overtly satanic, and so it was basically a battle of good versus evil in a very very toned down way compared to what it is today. You know, as I got into my 20s, and you know, I didn't have a TV, but you know, I was still aware a little bit of what was going on in that area of entertainment, and the performers that they had at that point were, you know, like overtly demonic. Things that it wasn't just good guy versus bad guy. It was like demons versus, even the good guys were not very good. The good guys were, you know, usually people with poignant character issues. And you see this a lot in the other parts of pop culture too, where you have the anti-hero. You know, like the good guy in a story is not very good. He's just less bad than the bad guy. You have this darkening that has been taking place throughout all of our pop culture, and frankly throughout all of our culture, even getting aside from TV. The good guys are just the guys that are not as totally given over to evil as the bad guys. You know, I was sure that when I became a father, I didn't want my kids taking in all this stuff. Thank God my wife was on the same page with me, and you know, we decided that when we did start having kids, we would not have a TV at all, nor would we take our kids to public schools. We ended up homeschooling, which I think is great. You know, neither of those two things would I change. Let's see, where else to take this? One of the things that really struck me a lot is the way that people are given a menu. Usually there's just 2 items on it. Occasionally there might be a 3rd item, but normally the choices that are presented to us by this world, it's just 2. And the idea is you pick the lesser of 2 evils. So, you know, the idea is you're encouraged, really, it's sort of an implicit encouragement to recognize that both of these choices are morally flawed, but you just pick the one that's not as bad. You know, never mind the idea that you could pick something that is just not on the menu they give you. They're just showing you this thing and that thing, but in truth you have 360 degrees of other space that you can explore and see what you're going to come up with. You don't have to be a Republican, you know, just because you recognize that the Democrats are crazy. You don't have to be a Democrat just because you recognize the, you know, many vices that are celebrated in the Republican ideology. You don't have to choose those things. You don't have to vote for a president. You don't have to take part in these things. But a lot of people, they just cannot seem to see that. And when it came to medical stuff, I think this is a place in our society where you see a lot of darkness. Everything from the diet that people are given to eat, the food that's available from the stores, the way that we, as a society, produce food. None of this makes sense. None of it makes, I mean, even economically, there are ways that it just doesn't make sense. And it's very dark, very dark. And you look at the horrible state of human health. This one area itself, I think, proves to you that we live in a world that does not reflect people's actual desires. It doesn't make sense. But unless somebody makes a supreme effort like Abraham did to try to break away from it and to follow God, there's just no way to break out of the tide aside from doing that. And you will be drawn into that current and stay in its flow. I may have mentioned a couple of times in passing that I had been in the military. I was in the Marine Corps, and I got kicked out because I did not take the anthrax vaccine, which was, during the time I was in, it had become a point of controversy because of there were all kinds of doubts regarding its safety, and I'm thinking, well, I'm not a lab rat. You could certainly make the case that I didn't have it all together to join the military in the first place, but I wasn't that. I had some things to learn about life, but I wasn't so clueless as to just volunteer my body for unproven medical stuff. So when the vaccine was pushed on me and I refused to take it, I ended up going to the brig for a little bit and then getting kicked out. And that left a big impression on me because of how much coercion is brought to bear on a person if they don't go with the flow. And here the flow was, medical related, and there's this huge symbiosis between the government and these pharmaceutical corporations, and the power that they wield is extraordinary. And we really saw this, a few years ago with the thing that happened. Forgive me for being so careful with the language, but I've seen how people have their stuff taken down if they use naughty words, so we're just going to have to be kind of creative and hope for the best. But the thing that happened 4 or 5 years ago now, I had already seen the face of evil coerciveness back in my Marine Corps days to, that was another thing. My wife and I, before we had kids, we said they are not getting these, we aren't going to let them get sticks in their arms, if you know what I mean. Because nothing that is good requires that much coercion. For those of you that love and study the Qur'an, one of the famous verses in the Qur'an is what they call the Suratul Kursi, which talks about just how exalted and mighty God is and how He sustains everything, the entire universe. And, He sits enthroned upon all things. And the very next verse that comes after this is, again, a famous verse that says, La ikraha fid din. There is no compulsion in religion. So just, imagine the way that God reaches us is through appealing to our, ideally the way that God reaches us is by appealing to our loftiest nature. And we, as human beings, as believers, are not supposed to bring pressure on other people, but we're supposed to convince them in the best way possible. But in the medical world, do they do that? No, it's very coercive. So that's another dark thing about the world that I noticed in the course of my life. And of course, we talked about the false dichotomies. You're either Republican, you're a Democrat. And this goes into so many areas, silly areas, right? People will fight over ridiculous things, Ford or Chevy. Packers versus Vikings, for American football. None of this stuff is, worthy of human emotion. The way that people find a sense of identity in this and, see the other as, opposition and as an enemy is weird stuff. And, people do find their identity in things like, clothing brands, political party affiliation, careers, where they went to school. And again, this is, if that's where you're grounded, if that's your identity, where does that lead to? You're going to die. And if your identity is not attached to anything that transcends death, well, then you're done. You're done. You've lost. I guess that's a bit of a tangent, but the other thing that really made an impression on me all my life has been the way that technology has evolved. And this also reveals an inclination that very frequently is quite opposite from what most people want. Yes, I get that there is usually a small group of people that is very excited about emerging technologies and is eager to adapt them. But for the most part, a lot of people see the technology coming, they don't want it. Then the development actually hits them, they aren't happy with it. But it seems like you just can't help it. In my own life, when I saw the emergence of the cell phone, I thought, who the hell is going to want to be available to everybody all the time? To me, growing up in the 80s, it seemed totally fine to just come home and you could check the messages on your answering machine and figure out if and when and whom you wanted to get back in touch with. And the idea that you have a device, basically a tracking device, and people can get up in your business for not getting back to them quickly enough. I just could not see the draw to that. And, I remember my first encounter with a society that had accepted the cell phone was in Germany. I'm guessing this was probably in 1998. The Germans were certainly ahead of us in terms of that technology, and so you very, very rarely would find somebody had a car phone or a cell phone in the U.S., but it was quite limited. It was usually just really affluent people or some business owners that might have that. But I went to Germany and I saw these high school kids with their handies. That's what they called them there. Maybe they still do. I'm thinking, why? It's just so weird. And when I told people back home about this, they agreed. Why the hell would somebody want that? Just hang out with your friends face to face. Why? And yet, for all of this criticism, you see that nearly everybody has a cell phone. Even if you don't want one, the pressures are such that, for example, if you have a business, you basically, you need a cell phone. There was a time, as I said, when I was a kid, you did not need a cell phone. You could run a business just fine not having one, but you need one now because all of your competition is answering phone calls immediately, answering texts immediately, and to stay competitive, you need to adopt these ways of doing business. You can't just... Look, I live in a place now where we have a lot of Amish people around us. And these guys, when I was a kid, growing up in Michigan, we had Amish by us. And, they didn't mess around. They were for real. They, no machines, no, at least, like no gas-powered machines, no phones. These days, the Amish, and look, it's their thing. I have no standing to tell them what they should or shouldn't do. I'm just saying that, look, even the Amish feel some sort of pressure to adopt these things, even though they have taken a stand where they say these things, just inherently have many dangers in them. They are undesirable for so many different reasons, and we aren't going to have them. And yet, here, you look at them and they have them. To summarize my impressions of life going through my 20s and 30s, it just seemed to me that everything gets dumber, weaker, uglier, more messed up, more degraded, that they're the very things that people are sure that they don't want end up being the dominant thing in society. How does that happen? As somebody that enjoyed reading economics, and maybe you do too, we're familiar with the excuse me, Adam Smith's concept of an invisible hand, which was his way of at least metaphorically describing the phenomenon by which all of these different demands that a society has, without any particular person or organization coming up with a way to organize responses to all of these myriad needs and wishes and desires that an economy has. You basically see this spontaneous emergence of order in an economic system that is sufficiently free to where demands will be met by supply, and innovations will come and fill in gaps of human need and so on. What I started to see, though, it's like there is an invisible hand that does a lot of bad things, right? There's like an invisible hand of cursing and affliction and degradation that produces all manner of things that people do not want. That, I'd ask, people in my family, people in my social circle, I'd try to get a feel for, well, how many people really want this thing that's happening? And the vast majority did not want it, but there it is. And that always struck me as something, as I've said before, sort of supernatural. I don't think that it fits to just wave that off as, oh, that's just the way it goes, and apply some sort of pedestrian explanation to these things that, to me, seem clearly spiritual. Another sort of giveaway is this world loves to enshrine contradiction, in a very humiliating way. So what I mean by this, things that are ostensibly devoted to a certain aim will overwhelmingly produce things that are the humiliating opposite of this. So, for example, you look at all of these ministers of health, let's say. This was especially highlighted in the thing that happened 4 or 5 years ago when people were getting the sticks in their arms. You would see these pictures of the elected minister of health in all of these different countries, and they'd be just the most extreme picture of what unhealthiness is. Very obese. Just how are these people given a position to oversee the medical and health affairs of the country is beyond natural. It cannot be explained by the mundane. And if that were the only case, maybe it could be brushed aside as just coincidence. But you look at ministers of justice, same thing. Just you look at their life history and their career, and it's riddled with so much corruption and injustice. You look at the education ministries of different countries, same thing. It's like they make people dumber. They make your kids dumb. So much so that homeschooling, thank God that it's allowed here. This is one of the things that America still has, is homeschooling. I'm surprised that the system hasn't come down on it. God protect us. But the homeschooled kids, far, far outpace the kids that go to public schools on average. I get that you could, single out, a very specific set of public schools or private schools that produce, well-educated students, but for the most part, no path of education is available out there that could do more to damage your child's intellect and concept of learning than the school system. In my view, that is no coincidence. And to go back to the health thing, look at the food pyramid, right? The pyramid where at the bottom was all the bread and the carbs and like nothing. The only way you could come up with something so perfectly opposite to the truth is that it would have to be on purpose. And I know some people are going to say, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. How could you allege that they would come up with a bad food pyramid on purpose? I don't know. To me, it's so obvious that when things are that wrong, it has to be on purpose. And, as I took this in, it's a pretty dark way of looking at the world, but I could not get away from the sense that it was accurate. And I started to wonder, are we in hell? And I mean that seriously. This was a period of time I went through in my life where I wondered, maybe this is hell. There's so much that just seems uncannily wrong, the opposite of truth. What do you make of it? What is this place? And in my thinking then, I've since moved away from that idea, but I have not at all rejected the idea that our world is not really that physical of a world. It's not a mundane world. We live in some spiritual realm that less perceptive people just, they mistakenly believe that we live in a natural world. We live in a spiritual world. It isn't hell, but it can be if you marinate in it and you don't make it your life goal to get out of here. It's a lot like hell. It's a lot like hell. And that brings me to the discovery of a certain person online. During the thing 5 years ago, the medical thing 5 years ago, somebody recommended to me this guy named Matt McKinley, who has a YouTube channel called Quantum of Conscience. And I found in him a really amazing similarity of observations, and so some of the things that I'd seen, I found echoed by him, and then of course he also had several of his own observations which were new to me, but I could recognize, like, hey, I was kind of on my way there, or yeah, what you're saying makes sense. Anyways, Matt McKinley, he's my favorite eccentric. He got into studying conspiracy theories, things like the school shootings, September. Well, that's another one where I'm not sure if it's wise to say that because of the banner ads or potential censorship. So I'll borrow a practice from Matt McKinley where we'll use hobo code for some of these things, and we'll call it the 7-Eleven job application. Back in September in 2001, the 7-Eleven job application, the shape of the Earth, things like the moon landing and the space program. So he originally got into studying these alleged conspiracy theories, examining their merits and demerits. He would look at like the World's Fair, impossible architecture, mud flood, Tartaria, predictive programming in movies, where, to take the example of the medical thing, for example, so many years ago. I, what was the movie called? Inception, was it? They've had basically a few movies and even some novels that are pushed into pop culture, where people are sort of pre-programmed to fall into these scenarios of pandemics and whatnot, and sometimes the details are so, exactly what had happened, even to the point of one of these books, the pathogen escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China. Not that I subscribe to that idea, but at least it ended up being the narrative that was given. And he would study into that. He would look at, like the celebrity Satanism, weird theories surrounding, well, here's another one we have to be careful, but you might know that a lot of the conspiracy theory world focuses on how many female actresses and singers and female celebrities, maybe they're the other thing. We'll just say it like that. Maybe they weren't always ladies. But basically where he went with it is, the more he looked into this, even in those particular, he doesn't necessarily subscribe to all of them, or didn't, but what he did find is that the more he would look into it, a lot of it did seem to be substantiated by facts. In some of these theories, they were really well substantiated. But what he found is that the typical explanations that were given in the conspiracy world, the truth seeker community, if you will, the explanation would basically be that our world is dominated by secret societies, people in high places that pull a lot of strings. They get people to do their bidding, usually by either threats or promises of reward, and so then people become compliant to their agenda. But the fact is, if you look at these things, let's just take the 7-Eleven job application of one example among very many, where you see the details surrounding this case in terms of symbolism and numbers that are put into different places, and things on, oh, look, this license plate had it, and this movie that was made like decades before, even decades. I've seen this even movies that were made, I think, in the 40s, where there was actually a lot of what would be called predictive programming that was related to the 7-Eleven job application. So I think it was 1947. So you mean to tell me that people were, pulling strings even back then? That they were, that all of the actors and the producers and the stage hands that were behind this movie, a couple generations prior to the actual event, that they were told to do things in just this certain way, do it just like this. Have the clock, for example, on the movie set, the clock has to have, the hour hand on the 9 and the other hand on the 11. And, things have to be arranged in this way. Look, and I'm telling you, it is this way. These bizarre things are facts. It's just the way that they're put together is such that um, the organization of these things and the execution of these agendas is at such a level of breadth. Uh, you would need to have tens of thousands of people in on it for just one thing, and then you multiply this out by all of these other areas, and it becomes clear that these things are not the result of cadres of sinister actors in the world that are all in on it and are literally conspiring to make things this way. The conspiracy, the conspiring, has to be at a superhuman level, because no human beings, no human organizations could pull this off. What you see has to be attributed to something greater than human beings. And so this was increasingly the conclusion that Matt McKinley was coming to. That, and I think that's why people do find conspiracy theorists to be ridiculous, because I think on a subconscious level they look at how outlandish, how improbable these things are, and they say it's so beyond the scope of human ability that it can't be that humans are doing this. And so because their concept of the world doesn't permit for superhuman agency, they just say basically if no humans could have done it, then there's just nothing to see here. It was just coincidence. It was just just the way nature went. But if you really, if you do believe that the world, if you do believe that the world is also inhabited by things that are beyond our perception and have, a superior capability of organizing and doing things, if you do believe in God, if you do believe in spiritual entities that are, lower than God, but nonetheless, greater than us, i.e. angels, jinn, whatever the case may be, well, okay, now there are all kinds of other possibilities, right? And so when Matt was looking at this, he saw a lot of the same things, but he obviously got to a lot of these things, from his own experience, and I was not that big into conspiracy theory, but a little bit, but some of these things I never looked into. I never got interested in, movies were not a big thing for me. So the predictive programming, I didn't know about that, but when I saw it later on, it was pretty amazing. For example, Back to the Future has all kinds of, unbelievable 7-Eleven stuff in it. Same thing with Mel Gibson's The Patriot. And it just, a real world could not pull this off. That's one of his trademark sayings. Matt likes to say, a real world, a world that really is a what you see is what you get, mundane laws of physics, of, physical cause and effect. It could not lead to the things we see. I know that there's that sentiment that exists that if you had a couple dozen chimpanzees and you gave them typewriters and you gave them, let's say, 1 billion years, these chimpanzees and their typewriters would eventually type up, all the great works of literature that we have today. It's just a matter of time. And there are people who believe this, and it's just patently untrue. This would not happen. It absolutely would not happen. And there are so many things in our world today where you could look at it and you could say, well, the odds of that turning out in this, incredible way are either the odds are 1 out of several billion, or it's 1 out of 1. If something is so astronomically unlikely that it would happen, but it did happen, the person with some, real common sense doesn't say that it was, incredible coincidence. The person with common sense says it was actually meant to be. And, one of the things about Matt's channel, he'll describe society as the ship of fools sailing down the river of insanity. People who just cannot see it. They can't, even when you try to explain it to them. They just think, it's just all normal. Nothing strange to see here. And that ship just keeps sailing, getting into crazier territory. And to them, it's no big deal. But if you've jumped off of the ship of fools and you've swum to the shore to get away from that stuff, now you look at where that ship is going, and it's just incredible to you. It just gets weirder and weirder all the time. To use one of Matt's examples, if you just think back to Obama, not very long ago, but he was asked for his opinion on gray mirage. I think you know what I mean. They wanted to know if he would support gray mirage, and he said, no, I think that's a step too far. Our society couldn't handle it. And so for him, just this thing, was too far. It was a bridge too far. It was too extreme to have gray mirage. And a decade later, maybe, a decade, and we're in a situation where not only is that considered totally normal, but it's gone so far that that's almost like, like stuffy old, conservatism. Now we live in a time where, I don't know, 1 out of every 10 households has a kid that, isn't sure which restroom to use. And it's gone that fast. And you talk to people about it, and they say, well, it's propaganda. It's the public schools. It's just pedestrian explanations for everything. And I mean, really, it would take, if it was really just propaganda, it would take generations for this propaganda to produce the kind of results you see. There's just something else at play. And I think the degree to which a person surrenders parts of their soul, the more that they're open up, the more that they've been opened up to this. So as I said earlier on, maybe a soul is not a 1 or 0 thing. You could end up having, 0.65 of a soul, you're 2/3 of a soul. And you could give away more, and you could give away more until you get to this point where you're just kind of receiving the radio signal. Imagine you have an antenna coming out of your head, and it's just taking that and again, I mean this just metaphorically, this is just by way of trying to find some sort of illustration for the concept, but something is able to organize this type of hive mind for a lot of people. And I think that is far, far more realistic an explanation for this stuff than, you know, propaganda or, you know, these kids were misled at school. But certainly one of the most important things in Matt McKinley is his observation that this world, this reality seems to generate conspiracy in real time, or at least conspiracy theories, right? It's sort of amazing that the more you look into something, the more material there is. He likes to point out that, let's say you had a great deal of interest in the JFK assassination. Well, here we are more than 6 decades from that happening, and there's still more information coming out. You just don't reach a point in time where you could say all of the relevant information has been examined and all of the, you know, sensible conclusions have been arrived at, and here's the truth of the matter. It just doesn't work that way. If you want to look into something, the breadcrumbs will be there for you to follow. It's like this across the board. If you doubt the things that NASA does, you will find what you're looking for. You will find exactly those things that confirm your suspicions. And let's say you disbelieve the moon landing and your friend is a big believer in the moon landing. If you two both do your research, both of you will come up with an endless supply of things to substantiate your position. And so when you meet up again with your friend, he's going to say, hey, look, buddy, I got this, and this, which proves that they landed on the moon. And you will find all kinds of stuff that makes it certain that they did not land on the moon. And you can do this for, I mean, you saw it with COVID, right? You had all of this proof that it's a real thing, it's happening, people are getting sick, people are dying, look at this. You know, I have a friend who works in a hospital, and if you believe it, you will find everything that you want to solidify and strengthen your belief. On the other hand, if you don't believe it, you will find everything that you want to solidify and strengthen your belief. And what really is the result of this is that conflict is amplified. And so in a lot of these things, there is a certain place where it doesn't matter. What matters from this, you have this potentially, you have this broad world now where there's so much conflicting information that you could just spend your life opposing people on the other side. I could spend a lot of time trying to convince people that viruses don't exist and that there might be better explanations that would fit the data and would explain why people get sick. And I could give my life for that, you know, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. I could make it my whole focus in life. And other people could do the same thing, and you could you could get carried away with this, and multiply that by every other conflict out there. And these, in a lot of cases, are big deals, right? I mean, if it was proven that viruses don't exist, what are the implications? Well, it would be pretty big, right? All kinds of our ideas about health and what it means to avoid illness would have to, necessarily be adjusted. But would that happen? I've seen enough of the world to know that even if a very eloquent, highly credentialed person could make a bulletproof case that viruses don't exist, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't go anywhere. It might make a difference for a few people that would listen to it, but it would make no difference in the world. And neither would it make any difference. Look, how about with the 7-Eleven job application? You have, the third building. The third building went down. You can bring that up to people, and it doesn't make any difference. And in fact, you could take it a step further, like Matt has, and say that these mistakes are done on purpose. We aren't just such clever people that have, using our craftiness and our intellect and our discernment, that we've caught the powers that be in their own lies, or we've seen their internal contradictions, or we've seen them. No. If we have seen anything, it is on purpose. These things are exposed so that a few people will see them. And again, that just increases their zeal to, wage ideological and even physical battles with the people on the other side. And so basically, there's just always fuel added to this fire. The result of it is always a sense of resentment, opposition, conflict. A person can become very despairing. For example, the idea that maybe this is hell. Now, that's a very despairing idea. The whole idea that, Republicans will look at liberals and, think of them in the worst, darkest possible terms, and vice versa. Liberals will look at Republicans and think of them as, the worst possible things. All of this is clearly meant to throw gasoline on a fire. And you can spend your whole life engaged in this sort of thing, deeply engaged in these pursuits that do nothing but draw out a lot of emotion. It's all negative, dark emotion, and you will be spent. And people who have studied this, I can't think of the name of the person, but they've basically said that it could be that it's like we are being used as food, in the sense that some sort of spiritual beings are feasting upon our emotional states, especially if they are negative emotional states. And the term given to this, again, I don't know to whom I should make the attribution, but I guess the going term in the street is louche. So they're harvesting louche. They're harvesting your anguish, your despair. So where was I going with this? I was describing Matt's work looking at this stuff. And there was a time earlier on in his life, he explains it in this way, more or less, that he thought that he had arrived at the finish line. You know, like he was, I guess, he arrived at the finish line. Like to see through this trick was sufficient. Right, to have this lucidity where you see the illusion of the world and you understand that it's this invitation to get into a fruitless conflict, a life of ongoing, draining conflict, to just see through that trick and to abstain from getting into that was the victory. And, you know, your work was done. And, you know, eventually he saw that there's actually more to do. And he came up with this terminology to say that was just part one of a person's work in this life. And part two is what you do after you've decided to abstain from this hellish, you know, milieu of warfare and, you know, being emotionally drained. And in this sense, I see Matt as a sort of Abrahamic figure. He himself is not, he's not religious. He grew up Catholic, but he's not Catholic. He's not antagonistic to people of faith. He basically, you know, he's made it a point to, you know, he's apologetic a lot of times if he has to say something that about Christianity, for example, that he knows is going to get people upset, and he doesn't mean to be insulting or any way. It's just he's basically said a lot of times that the way that people live out religion doesn't make him convinced that they've got it. You know, and you know, some of the doctrines are you know, nonsensical, and he sees that a lot of the you know, dark stuff that happens in the world, it uses religion too. It absolutely uses religion a lot. By the way, he came up with this term for this dark phenomenon that he calls Notnilk. And he himself will admit that it's basically analogous to the Christian Satan. But he doesn't want to call it that because he doesn't want people to just sort of fall into the same limitations of thinking. You know, to call it Satan, now everybody's going to just say, oh, this thing, this adversarial, malevolent force in the world is Satan, and they're going to look at it through the lens that they've been trained to see these things. Whereas if, you know, some odd name is given to it that is a unique name that hasn't been used for anything before, then at least it leaves the door open to, you know, curiosity in the sense of an ongoing study of what it does, instead of just assuming that we know everything about it because it's already been named in our religion. So he's got this term Notnilk. It's just Clinton backwards. He did that not because he saw the Clintons as Satan, but their name was in the news so much, and okay, I'm gonna, instead of giving this entity some, uh, scary or formidable sounding name, he was gonna sort of dishonor it by giving it a stupid name, which he thought, what could be dumber than to take Clinton and put it backwards and call it not milk. Anyways, what I was getting at is, in so many ways, this guy's examination of the world around him echoes what we have of Abraham living in this world, living in the world that he did, and putting a critical eye to it, examining so many of the assumptions and the beliefs, and sort of cracking the code and moving onward. Now with Matt, he does find a lot of things in Christianity that he just can't buy, even if he wanted to. If you watch him enough, you'll see that it's really because he has his own personal theology is such that God is too majestic to really harmonize with a Christian theology. He sees a lot of things in Christian theology that are just not good enough to be God. So I'm curious. I think if he was, and by his own admission, he's not really well trained with theology. He, in his own words, it's pretty superficial in that area. But I have to wonder if he could see the Qur'an and its majestic presentation of God, and also the Qur'an, I think more than the Old and New Testament, the Quran makes it a point to underline the fact that this world, which it calls the dunya, is a world where there is operating all kinds of unseen things, entities that are beyond our perception, the ghaib. And I wonder what his take would be on that. Maybe Christianity, doesn't push all his buttons, but perhaps Islam, or at least the Quran. I mean, there's a difference between faith and religion, and so you see the same. Some of the, quite a few of the same things that have happened to other religions are currently happening in Islam. Something can go from being a faith to becoming a religion. People can find their identity in a religion in a way that's not healthy, and I don't believe is the goal given to us by God. And so, if somehow I wonder if Islamic faith, as a distinct from Islamic religion, if that can be presented to him, I wonder what his take would be. So, Matt, he came up with this part one. Part one is to see through the trick, but part two is what you have to do once you have seen the trick. So the best thing a person can do once they see the trick is to spend little or no time it's probably impossible to spend no time on it, but it should be reduced as much as possible. The amount of time that a person spends absorbed in the trick, all of these deceptions, all of these false objects of our attention in the world. And part two would be figuring out, like, okay, now that I realize I'm in an unreal world, that should be the greatest news of all time, because, you know, the unrealness of the world necessarily implies a certain realness of me. Why would I be subjected to living in this world when I see so much of it? It's like reality is giving itself away. Reality, this world, I should say, gives itself away. It shows you that it is distracting you. And so what follows then is you say, what is it distracting me from? Right? If I can get pulled into all of these conflicts with other people, if I can get pulled into all of this investigation that leads to nowhere, investigation of conspiracies, investigation of history, of politics, of all these things that in the final analysis are fruitless, the very fact that I'm being pulled in this direction means that if I were to resist that pull and to orient myself to the opposite way, somewhere in that I would start to find what is my real path, what is my purpose. And I think, again, to tie it to Abraham, if he could see that there was this inappropriate, insistence on idolatry in the whole world around him, the implication there was that the truth has to be that God is beyond anything that could be similar to an idol, right? God has to be transcendent. He has to transcend physical form. He has to transcend matter. He has to transcend time and place. And so this is how Abraham becomes the father of monotheism, the father of the prophets, and you see that after him, all of the prophets, again, they underscore this truth. You see this very powerfully in the Qur'an, where it's, the number one thing that it goes about very emphatically is how transcendent God is, how unlike the limited world God is. Well, in the same way, when we find that there are all these enticements to get drawn into this world which is not very real, the opposite of that is to go for God, to go for that being that is unlike the world, and that relationship with Him would be that relationship which would be unique and would not be in common with these false things of the world. So I had an idea that if we look at the book of Genesis and its description of the Garden of Eden, as most people know, there are two trees there, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so the tree of life, of course, represents that ideal paradise life where it's just pure goodness, pure vitality, supplied by God to His creation. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they were forbidden to eat from it. And what I find intriguing about this is that good and evil are paired together. So in other words, it's not that you have a tree of life, a tree of the knowledge of good, and a tree of evil, and God said, don't touch the tree of the knowledge of evil. No, instead it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil paired together, which suggests to me that this that it is describing good and evil relative to one another. It's not pure good, it's not pure evil. It's this always sifting through things that are more or less good, more or less evil, always trying to find these positions which are never the ultimate position. It's always just staying in this whirlpool. You're getting a little bit better than you're hitting a higher place than, let's say, these people that you think are really off, you know, that don't get it at all. You know, they have the wrong idea, they're aligned to the wrong cause, the wrong choices, and I'm at a better one, and then I'm at a better one, and then you know, I can always keep finding fault with you know, this or that camp, this or that philosophy. And probably just owing to our nature and to us being in the world, that is just a fact of life, that we are to a large degree by necessity engaged in these engaged at this level, which is still just relative good and evil. We're still sort of engaging with the items that are on the menu that's given to us by this world and all that goes on in it. But the original idea is that we would not get drawn into that. The original idea is that we would just eat from the tree of life, that we would be engaged in a pursuit of absolutes, that we would be relating with God directly, and that relationship would make us truly alive. And it's interesting that in Matt's work, he sort of recognizes a parallel like this. You have a lot of people that have no concept of the world being unreal and just partake in all of its things unthinkingly. But then you could graduate and say, now I see the tricks. I see the tricks, plural, right? And so they get very engaged with you know, figuring out every conspiracy theory or figuring out which side to take, figuring out how to oppose the opposite side. They're caught up in the tricks. But then you get to a level where you say, no, all the tricks are really just facets of one trick singular. And that trick is to distract me from the real thing I should be doing. And then to know what is that real thing, you have to figure out, well, what would be the opposite of that one all-encompassing trick? And that is to see that this life is given to us, even with all of its faults, even with the way that evil and deception and degradation are allowed to be here, that ultimately, for the successful person, successful in the eyes of God, is a person who is able to use this world as sort of like a catapult to leap from it towards that which is absolutely good and true and beautiful, to leap back to God. That this world is meant to make us appreciate God and appreciate that relationship with God. And as much as we are able to do so, we are supposed to strive to get back to that tree of life, to that relationship with God, and to not get ensnared in the things of this world. And, it makes me think of a commentary that I've heard on the Shahada from other people. There is no God but God. La ilaha is that first half of it. So that la ilaha is a negation of the things that wrongfully are taking God's place in most of society. You need to do some work in that first before you can say illallah, before you can say but God. So first there has to be the negation of false gods, of false values. You need that first, but you also can't stop there. There has to be that concluding part, illallah, but God. And then together you have somebody that is always able to negate, or at least keep at bay, the false gods and the trick, and they're always able to maintain that connection with God. I hope you got a blessing from this. Thank you for listening, and God willing, I look forward to doing this again sometime. Be well, and hopefully we will do this again soon.